Great, thanks for that intro, Carol, and for inviting me to this talk. I'm really excited to be here and to meet all of you. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about the tool that my organization is building. It's called Elicit. It is a research assistant that uses language models like GPT-3. It's been very heavily inspired by the systematic review process. So we are so grateful for this community and just the broader academic discipline that has been so thoughtful and careful about evidence synthesis. We've really learned a lot from that. So it's exciting to meet some of you today. As for my intro, I'm the co-founder and COO of OTT. OTT is a nonprofit machine learning research lab. We have a team distributed across the US and Europe, and OTT's mission is to scale open-ended reasoning, scale high-quality reasoning. We want to make evidence synthesis a lot more plentiful, even more rigorous, apply it to more things, and help people kind of discover high quality evidence, reason about it, and just make better decisions in their lives using that evidence. We're really excited about the power of artificial intelligence and these language models that I'll introduce today to support that and scale that up so that it's not just this community, but really a broader community that can benefit from this discipline. But there are also a lot of risks, and it's really important to us as we're kind of applying these technologies to carefully understand the risks both of the technologies as they are today, but also how they can, some of the kind of consequences that we might see in the future and some of the risks we might see in the future. So a large part of our organization is really pushing the research agenda forward in terms of building more interpretable, safe, and aligned AI systems. So I'll get into all of that. And I will mostly spend my time talking about Elicit and kind of use that as a jumping off point to talk about different things. I guess specifically at OTT, I run product and operations, and then my co-founder Andreas runs research and engineering. And then in my past life, I worked at a fintech company called Upstart that uses machine learning for consumer credit. And I was also in management consulting prior to that. Okay, so I'll share my screen. This is Elicit. It's actually open, so you are welcome to try it yourself, and you can play around with some of the features that I'm showing you today and vet it for yourself. It's completely free. You can sign up at elicit.org. And the main workflow in Elicit is literature review. So researchers come and they ask a question, and we provide them with a lot of evidence and information to start learning about the research on that question and to answer those questions. Ultimately, where I want to get to is a view like this. This is where I'm hoping to take you today. So with a high-level research question, something like how effective is finasteride for reducing hair loss in women, give you back a table. Hopefully something like this looks fairly familiar to each of you, where each row is a title and there's just a wealth of information, obviously some metadata around publication year, citations, but also funding source, number of participants studied, population characteristics, age, region of participants, intervention, dose, duration, outcome measured, limitation, study type. I think many of you might be doing this maybe either completely manually or in a semi-automated way. I'm really hoping that Elicit can accelerate that process for you and really give you a lot of leverage. So we're going to build up to that, but first we'll just start with this page. And I'll start again with this question. So how effective is finasteride for reducing hair loss in women? I personally became interested in this question recently. I had heard a lot about Rogaine, which is the branded name of minoxidil. And then most recently, people had told me about finasteride. So I kind of was trying to understand the difference. And these are both used for preventing hair loss. So the first thing that happens is finding the papers. I'll spend a little bit of time explaining how we find the papers. We currently search over about 195 million papers. That's less than Google Scholar and comparable to Semantic Scholar, which is the primary database that we use. We also use OpenAlex. And what we've done is take the titles and abstracts of all the papers that they have in their database, and we've embedded them. We use this semantic embedding technique, this machine learning technique to understand, to identify which papers have the most similar meaning to your query. So this is quite different from keyword search, which is what a lot of academic databases use. Our goal is to not require you to stuff your query with a lot of keywords and to think of every single possible version or permutation of the word, but really give you relevant content, even if the paper uses words that you yourself did not use. So a lot of researchers do talk about how nice it is, especially when they're starting in a new domain, when they may not have all the keywords, to find papers that are relevant, but even if they were different terms, or papers that are relevant, but maybe in an adjacent domain. So what you'll see here is a table where each row, like I said, is a paper. In the first column, you see the paper title, Efficacy of Finasteride, 1.25 milligrams on female pattern hair loss. You can click into it and see the full abstract. and access the paper directly yourself. So the benefits of the semantic search, it's called semantic search. The semantic search approach that we use is, like I said, it allows you to find papers that are relevant. So in this case, it'll return papers that talk about females, even though we only looked for women. It'll return papers that talk about, let's see, like hyperandrogenism, even though that wasn't in our query. We said hair loss, and hyperandrogenism, I think, is actually more about hair growth. So again, it kind of gives you papers that are relevant, even if they don't use the exact keywords. There is a downside to that. Sometimes you want the exact keywords you're looking for. We found that when people use this for, say, like genetics research, or like very specific genes or chemical compounds, you actually don't want things that are kind of fuzzily related. You want exactly what you're looking for. So to accommodate that, we have these keyword filters. So you can always limit the papers to the ones that do explicitly mention a particular keyword. So maybe in this case, I'll try something like oral administration. And then I can narrow the papers to just those that explicitly talk about oral administration, mention those words somewhere in the title or abstract. So I can get a little bit of the best of both worlds here. Let's see. And then I guess one other approach that we take that is a little bit different is we don't rank by citations. So I think, again, this is kind of a pro and con depending on what you're doing. I think in some cases, people are surprised to not see really highly cited papers come up as results. And in other cases, people are really glad that we're surfacing paper, that we're not kind of perpetuating some of the biases that exist with citation counts and perpetuating other types of papers and focus more on relevance. I think as we go forward, we're going to have to think about how to contextualize information that is directionally helpful, like citations, but still imperfect. And that's something we'll continue to iterate with. Another feature of Elicit that's pretty unique is this starring feature. So if I star a couple of papers, I can find more papers like the ones that I starred. So I'm going to start by starring this one that talks about androgenetic alopecia. Maybe I'll go back to hyperandrogenism. It seems like kind of a narrower subset of what the rest of the papers look like. I'll get rid of the rest. So I'm going to say these are the ones, maybe I'm most interested in, like androgenetic alopecia or something like that. So these are the ones that I want to use as kind of my seed. And from here, I can click show more like starred, and I'll start to get a lot more papers like these. So here's another one that talks about normoandrogenic postmenopausal women, another one about that, another one about androgenetic alopecia. So you can see that Elicit has kind of picked up on these two cues that the researcher has given and found a lot more papers that are similar to those. This is really helpful when your initial Elicit results aren't super relevant. It doesn't seem to be quite picking up on what you're looking for. You can guide it using these stars. And then concretely, what we're doing here is we're doing a forward and backwards pass through the citation graph. So looking at all the references of each paper and all papers that came later that cited this starred paper. So again, I think a lot of people, when they do systematic reviews in an effort to be comprehensive, will kind of manually or use tools to one at a time go through the process of searching through all the references and citations. We've tried to make that a lot easier. I should say, yeah, I think I said this before, but just to kind of emphasize again, we studied people who do systematic reviews and were really inspired by the explicit and like kind of structure and replicability of their process. And so that would directly inspire this layout and how we thought about Elicit. It's not, however, meant to be a systematic review tool. I think that systematic review process has really high expectations of accuracy that an early tool like Elicit can't currently meet. I think there are a lot of ways it can be helpful, but I'm not here to pitch it as, you should replace your systematic review process with this. I think it's still quite far from that. I think it's just helpful, and it's more of an effort to take a really well-designed discipline and make that broadly available, even in contexts that that don't know about the systematic review methodology or for where systematic reviews don't exist. Okay, so that's kind of how we can look at papers. And then the other column that you'll notice here is this takeaway from abstract. So what we do here is for each paper, we take the abstract and then we use one of these language models like GPT-3 to try and generate a question-specific summary. So this is something that's also unique to Elicit. First of all, a lot of academic databases don't have summaries. I think they're starting to experiment with some of them, but they definitely don't have summaries that are question-specific. So we're on the fly generating a takeaway that will help you answer your question, and you can kind of skim them and see and sometimes they help you determine whether the paper is relevant to read or not. So it's kind of a first pass at weeding out irrelevant papers. So, it'll talk about, finasteride is effective. This paper seems to find that it's effective for reducing hair loss in women. This one did not increase hair growth or slow progression of hair thinning in this type of woman. And then you can kind of click into it and confirm that this is correct. So it says, this is the takeaway that the model generated. This is the abstract that it used. And it seems like in the conclusion, this finasteride taken did not increase hair growth or slow the progression of hair thinning. A lot of times we do try to keep this takeaway fairly extractive. So try to stay faithful to the text as much as possible. And so sometimes it's just word for word what the abstract says, what a sentence in the abstract says. Other times it kind of summarizes at a little bit of a higher level, or like gets rid of kind of confusing detail. So that's kind of the process of finding relevant papers, and figuring, you can always kind of show more to see more papers. This is like maybe the initial step of collecting papers that seem relevant. Another feature that we have, it's a little bit, this doesn't happen a lot, but we do have this possible critiques feature where we look at all papers that cited this paper and try to identify which of those citation statements are critical. It turns out actually there aren't that many citation statements that are particularly critical, which is kind of surprising. So a lot of times you'll just see 0, but it can still be helpful to see how did other authors and other researchers talk about this paper. But occasionally you'll see some that are really helpful talking about kind of the limitations of self-reported surveys or small sample sizes and things like that. Okay, then the part that I'm really excited to show you is how you can kind of build out this table and extract deeper information from each of these papers. I'm actually going to refresh my query. Let's see. So I want to get rid of my stars, and then I'm going to hide year. And you can also, while we don't prioritize citations, you can always sort by them. That seems helpful. Or if you're in a domain where recent papers matter a lot, you can sort by year, and you can also limit papers to those published after a particular year. So next, one thing that I really like to do is look at study type. So here on this side, you have a bunch of additional sources of information that you can extract for each single piece of paper. We call these columns, unsurprisingly. And there are a bunch that are predefined, but you can also create your own, which I'll get into later. And so you can add more information about the metadata of the paper. So, you can add authors. We don't show it by default, but it's there. DOI, et cetera, funding source, population studied, intervention studied, result, and methodology. I usually like to start with study type because if there are randomized control trials or reviews, those are kind of some of the most robust and rigorous study designs. So where possible, it's great to use them. Obviously, not always available, and there are lots of contexts when they're not the best kind of type of study to look at. But for a query like this, I would expect there to be a lot of randomized control trials and reviews. So look at that, and I see that it won't limit my set of papers too much to just focus on those. So I'll keep that. I can always just limit it to randomized control trials or systematic reviews, meta-analyses. Maybe if you're doing a meta-analysis, you just want to see randomized control trials. You don't want to look at systematic reviews. So that's like a place where you can actually filter by study type and limit your paper results to those of a specific type. And here, this is a classifier that we use to identify papers of different studies. It's more or less keyword match. And then, so from here, from study type, I have a lot of randomized control trials. I'm also going to filter for has PDF. So this basically gets us open access papers. If we have open access papers, Elicit can parse the full text of papers and get a lot more interesting information for you. Whereas if we don't have the PDF of the paper, we're limited to just using the abstract and therefore can only show you information that you might expect to find in the abstract. So I'm just going to do that. I filtered for has PDF now. And a lot of times what I like to do is just kind of orient myself and get a sense of what is this research space about. And I just want to make sure I'm finding the papers that are most relevant to my query. So I usually start with kind of the people that were studied, especially in this case, I was interested in women. So I'll start with something kind of broad, maybe population characteristics. And that will automatically populate information about the population studied in each of these papers. So 18 normal androgenetic FPHL patients, female pattern hair loss, I believe. 37 premenopausal women studied in this one. Woman with androgenetic alopecia in this one. Woman with FPHL in this one. So, okay, like a good amount of papers that are about women. This one seems like maybe it's more about men, so I'll just get rid of that one. And then from there, that gives me a good intro and I can go even deeper. So, and a little bit more structured. So let me look at number of participants. This one has 18, 37, 40. So this kind of pulls out some of the information here, 60, 110. If I want, I can sort by studies with the largest number of people. And for each of these answers, I can click into it and I'll see where Elicit is getting this information from. So this one looks like it's probably coming from the abstract based on the layout, so let me actually, I can just check. So yeah, it looks like it's coming from the abstract. So Elicit looked at the abstract and said, okay, 110 patients were studied here. But sometimes if it's not from the abstract, the context will pull from the full text. So this one, let's see where that's getting from. Yeah, this one's also from the abstract, a woman with androgenetic alopecia. This one, yeah, 37 women with female pattern hair loss. So this like it's reading through the paper and trying to find the part of the paper that is most relevant to answer this question. And then you can always click in and check its work, which we strongly recommend you do. And then if you want, you can open other links like the PDF link to kind of read it in context. And in some cases, we'll also show the full parts of the full text. That's population characteristics and number of participants. We can also similarly look at age. So, you know, some of these age groups might be more relevant to others. Postmenopausal women, 19 to 50 years old, 18 to 29 years old. So like a, you know, pretty good variation in age ranges. We could also look at region. So some of these studies were done in Italy or Korea. And then again, click in. Yeah, treatment with efficacy was evaluated by this group in Korea. So that gives us a sense of like, who are these studies about? And, you know, it's kind of the P in PICO, I think. Yeah, one of the feedback that Carol shared us when she was kind of testing this early with us was that the original versions, I think maybe it might have been this one, were too broad to actually be useful. I think hopefully these are a little bit more specific, but they might still be in a lot of ways just a starting point from which you have to kind of get into a lot more detail for your specific review. But we did take that to heart, and we did try to make them more specific relative to where they were before. Then next, now I feel like, okay, I probably, you know, these are the people that were studied by these experiments are probably the kinds of people that I care about. I'm roughly in this ballpark, and I want to get a better sense of what actually happened. So first, intervention is again kind of this like broader source of information from which I can go a little bit deeper. So I'll start with intervention and just confirm that we're still talking about finasteride here. Great, it looks like it's all about finasteride. A lot of oral administration I'm seeing. And then now that I can, you know, if I, for example, didn't have results for finasteride, I might kind of I might try to find a different set of papers, but it looks like we're still in the right category of papers. And so then I want to dig a little bit deeper. Maybe I'll look at dose and duration of finasteride administered. So 5 milligrams, 1.25 milligrams, 2.5, 1.255 milligrams. If I knew nothing about finasteride and how this research worked, now I know, okay, it seems like some of the common interventions studied involve like 1.25 to 5 milligrams of finasteride, and oral administration is like a popular way to do it. Duration is also really interesting to sort by. Maybe I'm like really interested in studies that have studied people for the course of 3 years. Again, I can look at how Elicit is generating this information. This is looks at it's found that the treatment was the group took 3 years of continuous medication intake, so that's how long they took this finasteride for. That's some information about intervention, and all of this is generated on the fly. So you know, we haven't pre-computed this information for these papers. We're not just showing them now. As I'm clicking each column, as I'm customizing the results of, you know, the specific papers I'm looking at, we are, you know, making these calls to language models to try and get this information as the researcher initiates it. And finally, we can look at some of the results-based columns. So here's one which is just what was the outcome that they measured. So, you know, in some cases it was a hair loss, but in this case, maybe it was patient satisfaction and photograph assessment. Hirsutism, I think, is quite different. So that can always be helpful just to make sure. This is the O basically in PICO. And then let's see. Yeah, we also have detailed study design, which can give a little bit more information sometimes. This one tells me that it's an open label. This was Yeah, otherwise it's maybe like a slightly more, for non-RCTs, a lot of times this gives a little bit more information, but when you're looking at empirical research, the study type gets you a lot of the way there. Then limitations is one that I also like to look at that we've been iterating on. So this, again, there's some information about what the authors say the limitations of their study are. So does not show objective clinical efficacy. This sample size is small and the duration of treatment is short. And it comes from this paragraph somewhere in the paper. Yeah. So this one is maybe it's a little bit more extrapolated than it should be. So in some cases, yeah, this is like maybe an example where it's like not super great of a summary of this paragraph at least. And to accommodate cases like that, we have this little feedback bar where you can flag errors that we should be correcting. It's kind of, I guess it's kind of duration of treatment is short. It's like a reasonable, yeah, extrapolation from longer duration of treatment. Maybe this is like a more number of patients, sample size is small. Yeah, so maybe it's fine. Yeah, and this one talks about how it was based on subjective and semi-quantitative assessment, had no placebo group. This was retrospective, so I think it's really helpful to know upfront what are some of the limits. I think a lot of researchers start with the limitations of the study and then read through it. I think it is helpful to know that upfront, obviously for the specific study itself, but in general, so that you can keep in mind what are some of the things to be thinking about as you're reading any paper in this field. So whether the authors, even for this paper where it's like not really clear, it's not obvious what the limitations were, you can keep in mind if you're reading it, thinking about the placebo group and the sample size, duration of treatment. In the cases actually where we don't show an answer, we'll still do our best to find the most relevant paragraph. Let's see. So this is not, we didn't find a very clear answer, but here's the most relevant part of the paragraph that we saw. And so you can still get some information, even if, we try to err on the side of not saying false things. So we'll like say, leave it blank more often than, err on the side of leaving things blank. But this is some way for you to still go and get some information or figure out, use this to navigate to the part of the paper that might have the information that you're looking for. And then, yeah, you can always, if you want to dig in deeper, you can always click into the PDF, copy and paste this and navigate to the relevant section. And then there's so that's kind of like all the capabilities of Elicit that might have been like very overwhelming, but hopefully you can see that we're really trying to get you a lot of information to be able to do your work. And we generally try to give you the pieces as opposed to giving kind of uninterpretable scores. So rather than saying, here's a paper that's really relevant, it has a relevance score of 9, we'd rather say, well, what does relevance mean to you? It probably means, studying the population that you're interested in, studying the intervention you're interested in the region you're interested in. So let's give you those pieces and then you can compile them and mix and match them in the way that you care about, as opposed to having a score that we've kind of created that is less interpretable. And similarly, you might have noticed some of these columns down here around pre-registration, multiple comparisons, intent to treat. This is like our way of breaking down the broader question of how trustworthy are these results, or how should I contextualize these results? And so rather than just have a generic or kind of like black box trustworthiness score, we start with first figuring out how people and experts evaluate trustworthiness. What are the different components of that? Let's break that down. Let's surface them to people so they can use it, and then maybe we can condense it in the future. But first start with giving the pieces as opposed to something that's not as decomposable. And then in terms of a couple of workflow things, if you star papers, you'll be able to find them later in your starred history. So you can just freely star without worrying about losing papers, and then come back to them later. And you can also share these URLs with all of these features. So if you wanted to send it to somebody else in your lab, they can kind of pick up from where you left off, and you can, it's just a little bit easier to share information and have these discussions. And then I guess one other workflow that's a little bit newer is the one where you upload your own papers. So this is a report from GiveWell, an organization that tries to recommend really effective charities. They do a lot of research to figure out which interventions have help with malaria prevention and economic development and employment. I found this this analysis they did of vitamin A supplementation. And I'll show you how to kind of try and recreate this table within Elicit. So I only managed to easily find 2 of these papers open access. The rest of them were paywalled and I didn't try that hard to get them. But if you kind of go back, if you go back to the main page, there's this option to run Elicit on your own paper. So maybe you already have a really thorough search that you've done on PubMed and you really just want to, you don't want to use Elicit to find papers. Maybe that's like a little bit not too reproducible, but you do want to get a head start on some of the data extraction process. You can upload your own papers here, although you can only upload 20 at a time for now. So I think if some of you have like thousands of papers for your systematic reviews, it might be a little bit tricky to start. But I'll just upload 2 papers. 2 of these papers that were in this table, and just to keep track of them, I'll add the authors column. Oh, yeah, and I don't think we can hide your citations and take away from abstract. So I have the Awasti paper here, and I think this is actually Dallaire or Ballaire, but that paper. And I'm going to try and replicate this table. So first we have age group. That's a column that we already have predefined in Elicit, so we can just call that up. Okay, 6 to 72 months. This one says 12 to 72 months. I think they might have made a mistake because I looked through the paper and it clearly says 6 to 72 months here. Yeah, we'll see. And then this one is 1 to 59 months here. So that's a predefined column in Elicit. I can just call that. But now these columns don't exist in Elicit, so we'll have to create them from scratch. So let's look at control group mortality per 1,000 years. If you actually just start typing or you copy in some text, it will add that column on the fly. So this is, you can both use some of the predefined columns that we kind of worked on and iterated and know a lot of people want, or if you have your own column, you can just create that and kind of experiment and ask your own questions over the papers. So again, these are kind of hard metrics to find, so Elicit didn't find any of them. But actually, if you click into it, it gets pretty close. So the correct answer for this one, I think, this is the mortality risk ratio. Yeah, wait, this one I think was a little bit more obvious. So the correct answer for this one was 126, so control group mortality per 1,000 child years. Elicit didn't manage to generate the correct answer, but it did find the paragraph with this information, which actually happens to be here, where they talk about the supplemented group and the unsupplemented group with deaths of 93 and 126 respectively. So it wasn't confident enough to produce an answer, but it will still help you find the part of the paper with that information. And I think this one, they do talk about mortality ratios, but this paragraph didn't have exactly the same information. And then similarly, we can try this mortality risk ratio column, and it'll get us pretty similar information. So this time it actually does get us 0.74, despite this like very strange formatting and PDF parsing, which is also what they have in this table. And then I think this one, yeah, the answer is 0.96. This is also strange formatting, but it did find the right part of the paper with that information. So you can create your own columns if you need specific information that's not one of our predefined ones. That's kind of how Elicit works. I know there was a lot of information, so if there are specific questions at the end that people want me to go through again, I'm happy to do so. So hopefully it just gives you, you got an introduction to its capabilities broadly, and then there's a lot more information and a lot more ways we can support specific applications of Elicit. The other thing that I wanted to talk about was just kind of what is the impact of this? How are researchers reacting to it? So right now we have about 40,000 people that have signed up for Elicit and have tried it. In any given month, about 10,000 or so people are active. And like somewhere between 500 to a little over 12,000 people use it for more than 5 days in a month. So we are getting a lot of really rich feedback. So I thought I would share just some of that with you. Let's see. We do a quarterly user survey. So every quarter we get a lot of feedback in app, like you saw. You can flag things that are correct or incorrect, but every quarter we do kind of a high level survey of how do researchers feel about Elicit. In our most recent one, we had a response rate of 1%. So, pretty small, like probably not representative, but still directionally helpful. That was 239 people, so not a trivial number. But yeah, there was a lot of people who received the survey. they generally, the feedback is really positive. So on a scale of 1 to 10, the average score of how likely someone is to recommend Elicit to a friend is 9. Elicit is, we're not really doing any marketing, so it's like all growing by word of mouth, and by far the largest group of people, where the vast majority of people said they were 9 or 10, said 9 or 10 to this question. So like very likely to recommend Elicit to a friend, and they actually are doing that because that is entirely how Elicit is growing right now. The other number that the other kind of measure that we track is how disappointed would people be if Elicit went away. And 46% of people said very disappointed. And in tech circles, a benchmark that people aspire to is 40%. So at this point, we feel like the product is really meeting a need and delivering something valuable. It's still early. There's a lot more refinement we can do, and still a very, very, very long way to go, a lot more work that can be done. But it feels like we're in the right space, like tackling the right problems, and it's just about iterating on the solutions. And then the other thing that I thought this group might be interested in is like, how are people using Elicit, or what are they doing with it? So the largest, the largest kind of job that people use Elicit to help with is finding papers to cite. It's probably not surprising. While we've been really inspired by the kind of systematic review process and the interventional or like empirical research domain, the vast majority of Elicit users don't use it for finding randomized controlled trials. There's everything from anthropology to theory to culture. Machine learning is also another group. So a lot of people do just use it to find other papers. It's a different way for them to find papers. A lot of people use it at the beginning of a research project to define a research direction. I think it's good at taking kind of underdefined questions and finding a lot of relevant information and surfacing information kind of efficiently, even if the researcher isn't entirely, they can afford to be a little bit imprecise or exploratory. But a good chunk of people, so about 20% of the people who responded to this survey, do use it directly to conduct a systematic review or somewhere in that process. So that's quite interesting. And then the thing we're really working on is helping people use Elicit to understand paper content even more. So right now, our product focus is improving the quality of answers to all those columns that I showed you, and also making Elicit better at answering harder questions. So like we're thinking about blinding, like how can we make Elicit helpful and produce good answers to questions around blinding procedures, or adherence rates, which are hard to even define at kind of among experts. Like, what is the adherence rate that really matters? There's many different adherence rates and intervention completion rates. So we're tackling kind of harder questions and going deeper into papers. And these are the ratings of the survey respondents on how well Elicit did at these different jobs. So reasonably well, but like I said, still a lot of room to grow. This was my favorite response to our most recent survey. How many hours does Elicit save you per week? And the estimates were way higher than I expected. So definitely some group of people for whom Elicit didn't save them any time, in part because they were still relatively new to the product. 23% of people said less than 1 hour. The largest group was 1 to 2 hours. And then there were 25% of people for whom Elicit saved them more than 2 hours per week. It's crazy, like 10% more than 5 hours per week. And it just seems kind of too good to be true. But even if we take pretty conservative estimates of these numbers, I think the overall amount of time that Elicit saves researchers per week is somewhere between like 250 to 450 hours per week. And that's actually just for these survey respondents, which are only 1% of our user group. So I think the true number of time savings could be orders of magnitude greater than that. And that's really exciting for us because our team is still small. And that actually means that the amount of time that Elicit is saving researchers per week is greater than the amount of time our team spends building Elicit per week. So it's a net benefit to the world so far. And then finally, the other thing that I thought could be interesting to talk about are just some concrete examples of limitations. These, Elicit is a really early product. Language models are really early technology. On the order of years, like a couple years. And so as a world, we're trying to figure out what is the best way to use them? What are their limitations, and how do we mitigate some of their limitations? One of the things I really love about working on Elicit is we get to understand that in a lot of concrete detail. So there aren't a lot of cases where you have this basically, like it's quite rare to have people. I think in the research space, there's like not that many cases where professional users are taking the technology and really pushing it to its limits, because for a very, very serious use case, so you can kind of construct experiments, you can hire contractors to evaluate quality, but it's totally different when a researcher who has no interest in language models and just wants the best possible research or insight possible, like uses a language model and evaluates, they are an expert, they are able to evaluate it for something that they care a lot about. So I think that feedback is really valuable for us. So one thing that we learned as we did this is, one very good researcher kind of flagged this specific example. And the specific one is that the model can't do conditional probabilities, but at a high level, they aren't kind of grounded in like mathematical reasoning. So while they've gotten a lot better at arithmetic tasks, there's still a lot of cases where they struggle in a way that maybe, I think some people might struggle with this, but like I think a lot of researchers probably wouldn't. So in this specific case, they looked at the model, said this takeaway: among sexually active adults in Amsterdam, 32% had these HSV2 antibodies, with 18% showing genital herpes. But actually, if you look at it, the correct interpretation is the prevalence of these antibodies was higher than expected, 32% in a population, and of those with antibodies, only 18% had a history of genital herpes. So it's actually a subset of the 32%, but the model didn't emphasize that, and its kind of subtle wording change led to quite a difference in meaning. So that's like one, I want to highlight that to kind of tell you how to that it's important to contextualize that, like, you are definitely expert. And so yeah, those are some things to check for, but I think it's also like a very subtle and really interesting failure mode that we were only able to find because we have these experts on the platform who are very carefully evaluating Elicit's work. One thing that we see a lot is that models kind of confuse references and pronouns. So it's like quite hard for them to keep track of what is this sentence talking about. So in this specific kind of Elicit, in Elicit specific case, one thing that happens a lot is within research, the authors of the paper are talking about another paper. And Elicit kind of gets confused and thinks these descriptions of another paper are about this paper. So all of these critiques here are talking about some kind of limitations. They make it sound like they're critiquing this paper and actually they are using this paper to support that the existing research is limited and stuff like that. So I thought that was quite interesting. That was like not something that I expected, but it's like really great to have concrete examples for. So those are just a couple. There are more. I'm happy to share more. But yeah, that's kind of the meat of what I wanted to share today. And then just broadly, in terms of our vision for Elicit, the way we think about it is researchers, and then even within researchers, people who are focused on evidence synthesis and this kind of systematic methodology are basically the power users of reasoning. They have the expertise and the time and to really carefully think about answers to questions and investigate them very, very deeply. But everyday people also often have research questions. Like, I was personally interested in what is a good method to prevent hair loss, for example, but they can't afford to spend a PhD or work full time on just answering every single question. So our hope is to learn, in a lot of detail what best practices look like, what good methodologies for evidence discovery and synthesis look like, then make them accessible much more broadly so that even someone who's not a professional can still get professional level methodologies or answers to the questions that they're thinking about. And right now, it seems really important to first start with literature review, because you can't really make sense of anything until you have good evidence. So right now we're kind of focused on figuring out how to get good evidence and how to make sense of good evidence, but in the long run, aspire to help with many more different types of research workflows and different reasoning workflows, even beyond research. That is the end of my talk.
Great, thanks so much. But so before we take questions, I'm going to ask Doug to launch our final poll, and then Doug, we'll just take a few minutes, and then we'll share the results with you as well. So, but in the meantime, I think we got one question from somebody who said, "Is Elicit free?" So, how do you use Elicit?
Yeah, right now it's free. We started experimenting with collecting donations, but obviously their donations are optional, so it is free to use.
Great. So I think this is the intro poll, Doug. I think you might
Yeah,
have
no,
to.
just because we hadn't shared these results with people, and then I'll pop up the other poll. Yeah.
Do you want to go over the results that we got from the intro?
Sure. So about 70% of our viewers have attended one or more talks, which is great. Thank you for returning and welcome to the newcomers. The primary goal in attending this talk was to find out what's new in evidence synthesis, to hear from experts in the field of evidence synthesis, and to gain more knowledge about synthesis methods. And some people also said to gain inspiration from their own research and to ask questions from the speaker. And now I'll just put the other poll in the chat. Okay, I'll just launch the other poll, which is the evaluation. And you can answer that at any time while we go through the questions.
All right, so if you could, yeah, do the poll, and then, but in the meantime, we got a question from Margaret Sampson. I don't know if you can see it, but basically for the recording is you have clearly taken note of features and best practices that are important in evidence-based medicine and are extracting that data. I hope to see it used to assist in systematic reviews. Will you talk a little bit about the language models that you're using, which is actually what I'm really interested in as well, the more technical part.
Yeah, definitely. Happy to talk about that. So the kind of language models broadly as a category that we're using, we use many different ones, but I think probably the most interesting and new one are these large pre-trained models. Some people call them foundational models. They are built by companies like OpenAI. There are other smaller companies, or other, there are a bunch of startups like OpenAI, Cohere, and a bunch of other organizations building these language models. They also exist internally at Google, Facebook. There are some open sourced ones now. In terms of their structure, they are trained on something, I think, like hundreds of billions of words on the internet. And so yeah, it's limited to kind of information that exists in digital text format. It's a lot of Reddit, for example. So I think it's like helpful to kind of remember that by default, the way these models operate is it represents like the average distribution of the internet. And then, for example, the way our job and organizations like ours have to take these generalist reasoners and turn them into research experts. That's like part of our task. And so there are these data sets of many words on the internet. And then the structure of the model is that it's designed to predict kind of the next token is what it's called. There's something like the next word, but it can be smaller, and it's usually a couple of characters. It's kind of like fill in the blank. So if I say, the cat ate the blank, the model is trained to say rat and not like tiger. And if the model says tiger in its training process, it kind of loses points. And if it says rat, it gets more points. And yeah, basically they're kind of trained to understand, you read and write fairly well, like they have these general abilities. But they don't quite have structural reasoning. It is a lot of pattern recognition. Some people will say intelligence and maybe even human intelligence is arguably pattern recognition. Other people will say like you can't get to logical reasoning by just picking up on lots of patterns. So that's one of the debates that exists.
Great, thank you. I also have a question about, you said your limitations of the model. So you said one was it confuses references and citations. And I'm wondering, how do you mitigate that problem? And actually the other problem too about conditional probability, like what are the kind of ways that you try and solve those problems that come up?
Yeah.
You have manual action where you have to, train the model again using better data.
Yeah, we do. We have had to do what is called fine tuning, which is use our own data set to train this generalist reasoner to do the specific types of reasoning that we care about. So we do that a lot, and that improves a lot of the errors. That's one way to do it. There are some like heuristical things that we can do. So like, I think, it's very, one cheap way could be to distinguish what person of point of view is being used. So like, authors talk about their own paper in first person and other papers in third person. That's like maybe an easy pass we could do first. Other than that, our kind of research team is looking at methodologies that will keep track of information that exists throughout the paper and try to organize that in logical ways. So I think some of the work they do might also be able to make progress on this.
Great. So we got one more question by Sruthri, who says that does the language model used in Elicit understand domain-specific things like second line or later line treatments for disease? ABC is some specific drugs.
Yeah, it does. It does understand a fair amount of domain-specific information because you can kind of think of it as having read every single thing on the internet. But it might not always understand the kind of logical consistencies. So let me see, like an example of this. Yeah, like this isn't a great example, but something like, you know, if 5,000 people started the study and the results were reported on, let's say there was a multi-day treatment, and 5,000 people started the treatment, and then the authors reported the results on 5,000 people, then you might be able to infer, and there's no other information, you can infer that the adherence rate was like 100%, all 5,000 people completed the study. But the language model will get stuck with inference like that. So yeah, that's like kind of an example of the type of thing, but it might understand that, you know, the treatment was a drug, and a specific drug, you know, intended to kind of target this specific intervention or part of the body, those kinds of things it might know, but like that kind of logical inference are the examples of things that it struggles with a little bit more.
Great. And then I had another question too. So you say that I really like the possibility of uploading, you know, PDFs of the papers and then doing, you know, using Elicit to do a bit of like, you know, data extraction for you. Although I do hope like that everybody would be checking, you know, like the text that Elicit uses just to make sure. But, you know, you said that you can create your own columns and everything. And I guess my question is like, how, like, do you use that information? So people, you know, upload their PDFs and they start tagging that information, right? And can Elicit actually use that information that people are uploading and using as columns to train the model further?
Yeah, we're hoping to do more of that. Right now, we're not actively doing that right now, but mostly because of a resource limitation than a desire. But some of the things we've thought about is, can we make Elicit more of an interactive workspace where maybe Elicit makes a suggestion, but you check your work and realize it's a little incorrect, or you want to phrase it a little bit differently, and then you can edit it and to, you know, make it useful for you. Then we can take that feedback and train our models to produce more appropriate answers next time. That would be really exciting. So that's partially why we're collecting like the thumbs up, thumbs down feedback, so that we can see where the errors are and then train against those in the future.
Wonderful. Yeah, because I think that it kind of makes Elicit into more of a crowd sharing resource as well.
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
if it has both of those capabilities, I think it's gonna really take off. And you said that there's like, how many people like use it more than 3 times a month? Like I missed that number.
Yeah, so the number we track is how many people use it 5 or more times a month, and it's around 1,000 people.
Wow, that's pretty great. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
your 10,000 a month is amazing. But yeah, just that
Yeah.
that many people are using it in its early days, right? I think it says a lot about, you know, the functionality and the ease of use. You know, I just love like your interface and how simple it is to use.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a very cognitively like overwhelming task. So it's really important for us to make sure thinking about how to do something in Elicit isn't mentally costly, I think, because the actually thinking about the substance is very, very difficult.
Yeah. So we have one more question. So, and if anybody else thinks of something, please put it in. So it says, does the ranking of articles in the search page change as when a user adds new columns, for example, PICO information study types?
It doesn't, but you can sort by those columns and then reorder the papers according to that sorting.
Okay, so remind me, how does the ranking of articles work?
So we do kind of a multi-stage approach. So the first thing is we have a database of 195 million titles and abstracts. We do this process called embedding, where we convert the text of those papers into like a numerical a vector, basically. And then we also convert your query into a vector. So we're kind of translating it from text into numbers. And that allows us to better understand how similar the text of the query is to any given title and abstract. We do a first pass of that. I think we end up with something like 1,000 results that are considered the close, 1,000 title, that's 1,000 papers that are closest to your query in terms of meaning and this kind of representation. And then we use a smaller language model to re-rank. And this model is even better at picking up on kind of semantic meaning and similarity. And that I think should get us down to about 20 papers. And for those 20 papers, we take the abstracts, the full text-based abstract, send it to a bigger language model, ask it to generate the takeaway, and then again, re-rank based on similarity of the takeaway. At various points in time, we've changed this process a little bit, so that might not be the exact thing that we have live in the app, but different parts of that we've tried, and it's more or less like at a high level that those are the types of things we do to find which papers are most relevant to your query.
Wonderful, great. Yeah. Do we have any other questions? Oh yeah, I was actually wondering too about, since we have a few minutes, about the feed bar, where people can make suggestions as to, so say for example, Elicit, has, didn't really give the right answer, and so somebody can actually, can they find the quote and put that into the feedback bar? So that's my first question. Exactly what kind of feedback you're looking for, and then I guess I'm wondering, like, I guess you've already talked about this, but how do you vet those, like, that feedback, because I think some people might be wrong in certain cases, right?
Yeah, that's really great. Yeah, it's a really great point. So it is really helpful for us. Any feedback is all really great, but definitely the one where you tell us what it should be is really valuable, because to have an expert's take on that is really useful. Otherwise, we have trained contractors to do some of the labeling, and I think they are vetted to produce good answers, but I think it's still quite different from an expert's perspective. And it just generally gives us more information about what researchers are looking for, which can help us better meet their needs. And then to vet them, we would kind of, in some cases, our team would look at it, or we would also have a contractor just like have multiple eyes on it and then try and reconcile the differences.
Okay, great. And Doug's asking a question. He says, what is the biggest challenge you've encountered so far in developing Elicit?
Um, let's see. I guess there's like a product-oriented challenge and then a technological capabilities-oriented challenge. On the product side, I mean, research is super broad, and there are well-defined methodologies, but it's also quite bespoke to the individual person. And even within research, lit review is still really broad, and within lit review, even like systematic reviews or kind of like systematic evidence synthesis methods. So I think just trying to figure out like how to precisely define the problem that we're trying to solve and what exactly is the workflow that both enables guidance and to new users, but also a lot of power and customization for very expert users, like make it both accessible and powerful. I think that's really tricky. So that's a lot of the work that we've been doing. And we spend a lot of time actually like trying to replicate a lot of researchers' methodologies, talking to them in detail, getting to the point where at least we can describe in language what people are doing. So with the systematic review process, that's like really well fleshed out. Someone can there are papers that walk you through step by step, like here's what you should do. But for the vast majority of research approaches, that doesn't exist. So we don't even know what we should automate or help with, because people can't even agree on what it is that they're doing. But those are all like very, very exciting challenges to have, and that's what makes our work fun. And then similarly on the technological side, like I said, these are really new models. So like basically none of the infrastructure exists. All the kind of different providers that we use will like sometimes, crash or like go out of business. And like there's lots, it's like very, very new. So in addition to building out our product, we're kind of building out this whole industry around us. And a lot of the kind of infrastructure isn't there yet. But again, I think that's what makes this so exciting and fun to work on. And yeah.
Great. And who is I know you're nonprofit, right? So who are your funders?
Yeah, some of our funders include Open Philanthropy, the FTX Future Fund, and so a lot of these people are kind of people who were really successful in tech and are now trying to invest a lot in AI research or high quality reasoning and decision making. So they care a lot about ensuring that AI systems are deployed and developed well and used for good means.
Yeah, I mean, I just love your product, your front end. It's so amazing, and I think it's going to make a huge, huge impact in the evidence synthesis world and for anybody else looking for studies of any sort. So I just want to thank you again. It's been a wonderful talk and I really learned a lot. And yeah, hopefully when Elicit develops in the future, you can come back and talk to us a little bit more about it.
Yeah, that sounds great. I'd love to. Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed sharing as well.
Thank you so much. Bye, everybody. Thank you for joining us.